Hi everyone, your friendly neighborhood Professor King here. In this video, I'm going to be talking about T.S. Eliot's Tradition and the Individual Talent. And at the end, I'm going to be posing some questions that will help you to consider this in relation to Walt Whitman's I Hear America Singing and Langston Hughes's I Too. So it's a good idea, if you've not already done so, to read those three texts, the Eliot essay and then the poems by Whitman and Hughes, before you watch this, because otherwise it's not going to make a whole lot of sense. In a moment, I'm going to be flipping it to the share screen so we can get going on the PowerPoint. But one thing I do want to say before we really get rolling on this is you may notice that our Canvas weekly modules seem a little bit long. And one of the reasons for that is because we're in the poetry unit. We're kind of starting the poetry unit right now. And a lot of those poems are accessed through websites. A lot of them are on the Poetry Foundation website. So it may look like there's a lot, but a lot of those are just like little poem links. So don't be overwhelmed by the looks of it. Just, again, keep trucking along. I'm not going to give you more work than you can handle. I have full faith in your ability to do this stuff. So keep that all in mind. All right. And I don't know why this, every time I record on this computer, it makes me look like somewhere between, you know, a blood orange and a Roma tomato, but whatever, we'll go for it. Anyway, let's start talking. I'm going to take it to the share screen. Let's start talking Tradition and the Individual Talent by T.S. Eliot. Okay. Here we go. Got it. Oh, subtitle settings. Let's do it. Okay. Anyway. All right. So, Tradition and the Individual Talent. This is a seminal theoretical essay, early 20th century, by someone who is considered one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. A man named Thomas Stearns Eliot was an American who ended up living in Europe, particularly London, but other parts of Europe. He was known as an expat, an expatriate. For, you know, through sort of the mid 20th century. He lived through both wars, World War I and World War II. He wrote poetry, he wrote critical essays, he wrote all sorts of stuff. So very, again, very renowned, prolific writer. Sorry, you're watching me getting a tour of King Manor right now, not because I want you to, but because my dog is barking outside, so I have to let her in. I'll get back to the video in just a moment. So that's T.S. Eliot in a nutshell. I mean, volumes and volumes of biography have been written on this person, and we are going to talk a little bit about biographical information as it pertains to Eliot, and this reading particularly. But that's what you need to know for now. Spoilers to come. All right, well, let me just get back to my enjoyable little spot here on my couch where I do most of my work. And there we go. The blood red orange, the Roma tomato is back for you folks. All right. Okay, so before we get into the text, we have to understand the types of criticism that we're seeing in this text and that Eliot was known for. If you read the biographical blurb in the Norton Anthology, I always take the covers off because they annoy me. That's why this thing's so dirty and gross looking. If you read the biographical blurb in the Norton Anthology, as you should be doing because it does provide some great context to the readings that we're doing, you'll see that Eliot is considered to have helped crafted and informed two schools of theory. One is New Criticism and one is Russian Formalism. And he, you know, Eliot's a guy, despite some of the shortcomings we'll be talking about, he is a guy who I mean, has really revolutionized the way that we look at literature in a lot of ways. And so I want to preface by saying that, because sometimes we find out some unsavory things about a writer or an artist or a poet, and we tend to throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. And people who've taken my class before know that I use that saying a lot. Throw the baby out with the bathwater comes from late medieval, early Renaissance Europe, where people would use a tub to bathe. And, you know, back then, patriarchal society, huge families, because we were still, you know, largely agrarian or rural or whatever. And so you would have these big families, and guess who would, you know, in this tub, in this basin of what started out as clean water, guess who would get to bathe first? Right, the father. So the father bathes first, and then maybe the mother, maybe the oldest son, right? And then we go all the way down the family of, you know, 14 children until we get to the baby. And usually the baby is bathed last. And we're using the same pot of water here. So imagine what that water looks like when it gets to the baby. Kind of murky, right? To say the least. It looks like, you know, the Long Beach Harbor on a bad day. So this saying comes from a literal notion of, you know, when people would throw out that dirty old bathwater after the last member of the family, the baby, had been bathed, the fear was that the baby would get lost in the murky water. You'd like forget about the baby, right? Kind of like a Home Alone situation. And then throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so what the saying essentially means is, you know, you have the kind of stuff that's gross, right? You have the gross, murky bathwater that you have to get rid of because you don't want to leave that in your house. But you also don't want to throw out the valuable thing, the baby. The baby's a valuable thing, right? Like, I don't have children, but I'm assuming that that's what it is, right? And so don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, meaning if you find out something unsavory about a particular artist or work of art or whatever, right, really consider its complexity. And we have a huge problem with that today, no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, no matter where you come from in this world, we've got a huge problem with just saying, okay, one unsavory thing, done, right? And the reason why I say it's a problem is because, you know, not for any sort of like moral or judgy reasons, but in terms of critical thought, it's a problem because then we cease to engage with the complexity of life. And that's what we need to do. Everything is complex. Everything is gray area. Very seldomly are things all or none, are things black or white. And unfortunately, in our culture, we've gone to those extremes, those polar extremes, right? In so many of our conversations. And we have to get out of that. We have to be more critically objective. We have to not invest our emotions as much and detach ourselves from situations so that we can see all of the working parts, whether we like them, agree with them, or not. Because if we don't, if we just say, I don't like that done, that's not critical thought, right? That's dismissiveness. It doesn't mean that you ultimately have to like something, but you have to understand it for all of its beauty as well as its warts, right? For all of its successes as well as its failures. And so Eliot is going to be a great example of our need to do just that. Anyway, so Eliot is you know, a heavy hitter in these two schools of thought. And he says that criticism is as important to culture as creativity. Again, bad and good criticism, because if we disengage, if we say, it's not in my wheelhouse, it offends me, it hurts me as a person, I'm done, then we're not being critical, right? In this, I mean, we're being hypercritical, right? But we're not being critical in the sense that we allow ourselves to look at, well, why is this thing the way that it is, regardless of my feelings about it, right? So keeping that in mind, right? That ability to ask the why is just as important as the impetus to create, as the artist, right? The person asking the why the artist did it is just as important as the artist who does it, according to Eliot, maybe according to some of us. So anyway, the first school is new criticism. And all of us have engaged in this school of thought at one time, because anyone who's ever taken any English class after maybe fourth grade, one thing they tell you to do is a close reading. And the close reading comes directly out of the school of new criticism. New criticism states that the critic should focus on what is contained in the text itself and not on external factors. External factors such as the author's life, the historical context, you know, things like that, things that would contextualize the work for us. So when we do a close reading, that is what we are doing. When we're just looking at the words and how they're constructed and the way that sentences are put together and the images that they evoke in the mind, that close reading is a very large element of new criticism. New criticism is a very old school of critical theory. That's why, you know, like if you call yourself a new critic, it's kind of like, yeah, well, everyone is. But what emerges from it is this close reading of the text that we all engage in, that every single poem, short story, play, novel that you're going to read, if you're a critical reader, you're going to do this, right? You're going to say, oh, you know, even songs you listen to, like, wasn't it bitchin' when Lil Wayne put these words together? Or isn't it cool when, you know, Taylor Swift said this thing and it alludes to this and it, you know, has this double meaning or whatever, right? You're engaging in new criticism. And somebody in their questions asked me, like, when am I going to use this stuff in my real life? You already do. You do it all the time. But, you know, we're helping you to hone this skill, not just for real life, which is more valuable than education, right? But also for education and for your career and for your role as a citizen in this country, right? So keep all that in mind. Then we have Russian formalism. And formalism, we're not talking about like going to a ball and wearing a prom dress. We're talking about forms, the form and the structure of language. So Russian formalism is also a school of theory that focuses on the text itself, but it also pays attention to the form and structure of text. So whereas close reading just kind of thinks about impressions, formalism looks at the structure of the language, right? Why did this person say this in this way? Why did they put this word after that word? Why did they put this sentence after that sentence, right? And by looking at these sort of aesthetic, and by aesthetic I mean pertaining to art and beauty and the sort of constructive aspect of art, right, as opposed to like the feeling aspect, although, you know, feelings are involved in aesthetics, by really focusing on these aesthetic aspects of art and literature, Eliot talks about how we become defamiliarized, or we go through the process of defamiliarization, which is where we make the familiar seem new, right? The familiar seems new. And, you know, we see that all the time. Think about like songs you've heard or books you've read or films you've seen where you know that feeling, right? You know the feeling of the person getting dumped, or, you know, the feeling of getting, you know, experiencing great joy or getting screwed over or whatever, right? But they do it in a way that doesn't make it feel stale, right? That doesn't make it feel cliche, but is a new way of you to sort of engage in that emotional process. And what Eliot is saying, right, is that it takes an artistic ability to render that in the audience. In other words, you can't just like do it. It takes a lot of craft. So what is tradition according to Eliot? Well, Eliot kind of thinks of tradition as what he says is the timeless and the temporal together. you know, so let's say you have this art, let's say you have an artist, your age, younger, older, decides, hey, I want to be an artist. I'm going to be an artist, right? And that person's parents automatically go, like, how much college or how much liberal arts college are we going to have to pay for no monetary compensation, right? But anyway, the person decides, I'm going to become an artist. And they decide, right, I'm going to create this amazing work of art. And that art becomes part of the canon. Well, if you remember to Samuel Johnson, right, there isn't like a specific canon list, right? But let's just say it becomes the new thing, right? Like it wins a Pulitzer, everybody's talking about it. How does it kind of stay within the canon? How does it become part of the tradition? Well, according to Eliot, right, that artist has to understand that she is part of an ever-expanding past, in that once she's created that art, if it blows up, so to speak, right, and it becomes this widely respected work of art, this widely respected work of literature, in order for that to be the case, that artist has to understand that she's part of this ever-expanding past, that once that present has passed, it's the past, right? And so her contribution to the canon, to the tradition, then changes the tradition, changes the culture, changes the canon. And so the canon is something that's dynamic. The tradition is something that's dynamic. It's always changing with the introduction of new art and literature. And that becomes what Eliot calls the ideal order, right? The past is always changing with the introduction of the new work of art, okay? And back to this idea of depersonalization, right? What you're going to start to notice in all of this arguing is Eliot has a preoccupation with depersonalization, with taking the individual away from the art. The art is the art is the art. Don't look at me. Don't look at the, you know, as they say in The Wizard of Oz, don't look at the man behind the curtain, right? Just look at the art. Just read the book. Don't worry about the biography of the artist. Just enjoy or critique the text for what it is, okay? And this comes about by what Eliot refers to as the extinction of personality, right? By realizing their place in the history of art or the canon, the artist surrenders the self and personal feelings for higher artistic claims. So it ceases to, you know, think of like bad poetry, right? Those of you who've ever been in a creative writing class, like, has anyone ever like read you their poetry and inside you're just like, ugh, cringing so bad because you're like, this is just like you getting your feelings out and there's no like craft to it. You know, you just like, my ex-boyfriend's a jerk. That's art, right? Like, ugh, right? What Eliot is saying is like, no, it's not that personal aspect that's the art. It's the craft that is the art. And so the more we can take that feeling and crystallize it and make it not about us, but about art, right? About the sort of universal human condition through our craft, through our structure, through the way we put sentences together. That's what makes it art. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Don't worry, we're gonna get to the other side of that, which is, well, what about the personal? What about the feelings? Because we all feel those feelings. That's the universal, you know, part of it. Why aren't we looking at those feelings more, Eliot? Anyway, we'll get there. So for Eliot, honest criticism and sensitive appreciation are, yes, I'm grammar Naziing Eliot's grammar because I can. Honest criticism and sensitive appreciation are directed not upon the poet, but upon the poetry. So in other words, again, look at the text, look at the work of art, look at the reading. Don't look at me, right? I just wrote the thing. Look at what it is as a work of art. Don't look at me. Okay, well, let's think about that, right? But before we get to really talking about it, want you to think about some further things that Eliot talks about. Eliot talks about this platinum analogy, right? And I'm not a science person. Maybe some of you are, and you can make this make more sense to me. But he talks about like how, you know, if you put platinum in this, you know, catalyzing experiment, the platinum retains its platinumness, but other things change, right? And the artist becomes this sort of more finely perfected medium as a result. The artist's creative process is the platinum, right? So how do you think, if I'm creating art, if I take, you know, maybe this personal experience and my ability to craft it a certain way, be that through poetry or short story or music or whatever, how do you think after I do that, that my mind becomes a more finely perfected medium? Think about it. Take a few minutes. Pause this. Pause it with my face looking like this. Okay. So how does the mind of an artist become a more finely perfected medium as it creates art, as it goes through the craft, as it perfects everything, as it drafts after draft after draft of writing to make this thing? And I want to think about some quotes from Eliot from this text, right? Eliot says, the more perfect the artist, the more completely separate in him will be the man who suffers and the mind which creates. So in other words, there's something that has to do with detaching the self, working on the craft, and that equals perfection to Eliot, right? Which, if we think about this statement, right, that kind of means that the suffering and the personal experience, it implies, at least from Eliot, that those things are imperfect, right? That feeling, that humanness is somehow imperfect. Think about that, right? And then the last quote is, or not the last quote, but the last quote for this slide. Poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but the escape from personality. And not as much for the reader, right? Because, you know, we listen to songs, we read poetry so that we can feel, we can identify with those things. But for the person creating it, to Eliot, it's to escape those feelings, to kind of start from those feelings and then to run away from them through craft, right? To start with ourself, but then to get away from that self through craft, right? So it's, again, we keep coming back to this notion of like a, I don't know, it's almost like a robot to me. Like the only perfect artist can be the one who escapes himself, to Eliot. Think about that. If you create art, if you're a musician or an artist or an athlete or a comedian or anything that requires a craft, you know, do you become more perfect the further away from yourself, from your soul that you get? Or do you become more perfect the more you incorporate that? Or maybe something else? Let's think. Maybe pause it here, think about it. Again, slow down, don't speed up. Slow down. Really ponder this stuff because that's what's going to help you become a critical thinker. All right, let's go to the next page. So Eliot talks about the structural emotion. And again, this is where we start to get to audience. The structural emotion is the whole effect or the dominant tone of a work of art, right? Think about the structural emotion of, you know, a Lil Uzi Vert album versus the structural emotion of the Real Housewives of New York, right? Like those are two very different structural emotions happening. And the, you know, both of them require artists and casts and production teams and media and, you know, all their various different things to create an effect or a dominant tone for the audience, okay? But what about this idea that it's not the feelings that art evokes that are important, but the way in which art brings those feelings about vis-a-vis its structure? In other words, like, why do you go watch movies or go to concerts or consume any sort of art that you consume? You know, maybe you check out graffiti, or I don't know, you know, maybe you're into like rodeos. I don't know. But like, do you go to feel for the feeling of it, or do you go for the sort of entire experience of the craft and how it's brought about, right? Like, do you look at like, oh, that's really cool what that person did with that beat, or that's really interesting how that person, you know, utilized their horse, you know, their dressage horse in a certain way, or whatever, right? Like, and then the other question is, what do you think Eliot means when he says that art, in particular poetry, is a concentration as opposed to emotion, recollection, tranquility? What do you think he means, and then do you agree with that? Again, pause, think about these things. All right, let's go to the next one. So I'm going to show you a video, and I think it will work because I did this yesterday with a video for my 103 classes, and they did work. But again, this preoccupation with separating the art from the artist, my first inclination is to be like, why does this person want us to separate his art? I'm going to find out more about him, right? I'm going to do the very thing that Eliot says not to do, because I'm a jerk, really. But that's what the critical thinker does, is like, again, when the artist at every turn, when the critic at every turn is telling you, disregard the man behind the curtain, what's the first thing you want to do? Look behind the freaking curtain and see like that little tiny guy who you're like, you're the one running the show, you know, like, of course that's what we want to do. So we're going to do that with Eliot, right? If Eliot's saying separate the art from the artist, we're all going, why are you saying that? Or at least I am. So one thing we find out is Eliot's not only very extensive history of being a phenomenal writer and crafter of art through poetry and criticism, etc., but also, again, baby and bathwater analogy, that Eliot was a raving anti-Semite in his time. And he has an anti-Semite, you know, people who are essentially bigoted, biased, racist against people of Jewish faith or cultural origin. So what are some poems reflecting these anti-Semitic sentiments? Well, we're not going to read them here, but if you want to do a little more outside research, you're more than welcome to. Eliot's poems Burbank, Gerontion, Sweeney Among the Nightingales, A Cooking Egg, and Dirge are all poems that he wrote in his lifetime that reflect or express anti-Semitic sentiments, okay? So, now that we're looking behind the curtain, we're very soon finding out things that are unsavory, right? But is this the moment where we say, screw you, Eliot, you anti-Semite, I'm shutting the book on you? Or do we say, what's that all about? Why, right? And how might it play a role in what we're reading? We're doing, you know, and by doing that, you're also kind of pissing off Eliot beyond the grave, because you're doing the very thing he didn't want you to do, right? So again, if you just kind of say, no, you're canceled, goodbye, that's a very kind of like, you know, morally upright, righteous thing to do, but it disallows in a lot of ways that objective critical thought of like, why is this guy doing this? And how do we solve the problem? Do we solve the problem by shutting things down? Or do we solve the problem by asking why and kind of getting to the root of it? So I'm going to show you this video that kind of throws a wrench in some of this. Please don't ask anything about me as an artist in my personal life from Eliot. So hopefully we can watch this.
Burbank with a Baedeker, Bleistein with a cigar. A lustreless protrusive eye stares from the Proterozoic slime at a perspective of Canaletto. The smoky candle end of time declines. On the Rialto once, the rats are underneath the piles, the Jew is underneath the lots. Money and furs.
Several of Eliot's early poems contain references to Jews, which seem to reflect the anti-Semitism that was widespread in the 1920s, especially amongst some of Eliot's friends, most notably Ezra Pound. After the atrocities of the Second World War, Eliot's references to Jews appeared particularly problematic, and many British Jews were deeply angered when poems which they saw as overtly anti-Semitic were reprinted without any change or comment.
You had all these appalling things going on in Europe, concentration camps full of Jews and so on and so forth, and that he chose to publish that in his selected poems at that particular time outraged me.
At a public reading in London in 1951, Emanuel Litvinoff read a poem called To T.S. Eliot, in which he expressed his anger at Eliot's failure to either explain or apologize for the references to Jews in his work.
This was 1951. It was an inauguration of the Institute of Contemporary Arts, and they decided to invite a lot of poets to read their poems. To my surprise, T.S. Eliot appeared and actually sat right behind me. Indeed, we shook hands.
To T.S. Eliot, I am not one accepted in your parish. Bleistein is my relative, and I share the Proterozoic slime of Shylock, a page in Stürmer, and underneath the cities, a billet somewhat lower than the rats. Blood in the sewers. Pieces of our flesh float with the ordure on the vistula. So shall I say it is not eminence chills, but the snigger from behind the covers of history. The sly words and the cold heart, and footprints made with blood upon a continent. Let your words tread lightly on this earth of Europe, lest my people's bones protest. There was a shocked silence, and then Spender got up and said, as a Jew as Jewish as Litvinoff, I object to this slanderous attack on my very good friend T.S. Eliot.
Did Eliot react?
He did react. He leaned forward so that I could very aware of his head just right behind my chair, and saying, "That's a good poem. That's a good poem." Whether he was saying it was a good poem because of the poetry, or whether it was because he felt that he was properly abused and felt somehow guilty, I don't know.
Clever dogs. Clever dogs.
One has to understand that English literary anti-Semitism existed at the canonic level, at the highest level of English literature from the 14th century in Chaucer. It's there in Shakespeare, it's there in Dickens. So if you bring together the existing and given English literary anti-Semitic tradition with a broader political and social context of Jew mistrust, Jew hatred, it's easy to see that this kind of work would both be immediately received without challenge, but also that it would be appreciated. Eliot's work was also, for him, entirely consistent with cordial relations with Jews. He had friends who were Jews, he corresponded with Jews, he wrote his poetry, and he couldn't quite understand why anyone really could take offense. It's not enough to say that he was insensitive to what was happening in occupied Europe. It's better, I think, to understand him as having no sense at all of the connection between what he'd written and what was going on.
The accusation that Eliot was anti-Semitic resonates to this day and is a scar on his otherwise unparalleled legacy.
Were you an admirer of Eliot?
Of course, a great admirer of Eliot.
All right, so let's think about a couple of things from that video, right? First off, if we just dismiss Eliot outright and say, you know, you're an anti-Semite, screw you, which is totally valid, right? Especially if you're a person, you know, of Jewish ethnic origin, and this is appalling to you, right? But if we stop there and we don't think about the historical context, the cultural context, I mean, Eliot was a person, again, living in Europe and England for a huge chunk of the early 20th century. So all of this anti-Semitism that, as the video points out, has been going on since the 14th century in that part of the world is totally normalized, right? Is something that perhaps, you know, for as smart of a guy as everyone purports Eliot to be, right, that Eliot wasn't even aware that he was engaging in this kind of unsavoriness, this kind of awfulness, right? Or that it was just like, oh, it's part of the culture, right? This idea that like these ones are the problem, but my friends are okay. Because I mean, Eliot was, he would go to these salons, these sort of like intellectual get-togethers at Gertrude Stein's house, and she was a Jew, and she was a very prominent Jewish critic and thinker and artist herself. And so, you know, and you had a person in the video who defended Eliot. So if we think about those things, right, we get into that complex, complicated, murky territory of, oh, this person, and, you know, Eliot's anti-Semitism doesn't stop at the poems. Like, he was very vocal. He and Ezra Pound were very vocal about their sort of distrust and lack of compassion for the Jewish people on radio announcements and things like that, and interviews and things like that. So, you know, what do we do with that? What from a guy who's saying separate the art from the artist, and in his own life, we're seeing like this very, ooh, how do I reconcile that sort of behavior? What do we do, right? But it doesn't stop there, because Eliot's poetry also has elements of sexism and ableism. And again, let's think about, instead of just saying like, dismiss him outright, because I as a woman and I as a person with mental illness could very easily say like, oh, you say horrible things about women and horrible things about mental illness in your work. You know, I don't want to read that. I could easily do that. But where does that get me if we are talking critically about this subject matter? It doesn't get me very far, right? So this is a poem by T.S. Eliot called Hysteria. And, you know, you don't have to know the ins and outs of this poem, but essentially the background information is Eliot had a very tumultuous relationship with his wife. They both suffered from mental illness and a variety of traumas, and, you know, trauma-related mental illness and trauma-unrelated mental illness. And as a person, as I said, as a person myself who has lived with a mental illness for a very long time, when I read Eliot saying like, oh, the art is the perfect thing and the artist is so imperfect, I definitely, hear those echoes, those vestiges of, well, I'm imperfect. There's something wrong with me. And so the way that I become perfect is through this craft, right? I could be totally wrong. That could be reader response, like me reading myself into his work. But, when he's talking about his discomfort with mental illness, he has to sort of separate it from himself. And he does so in this poem. If you read this poem, right? As she laughed, I was and this is a prose poem. This is a kind of stream of consciousness prose poem. And oddly enough, stream of consciousness was pioneered and championed by his female friend, Virginia Woolf, who also suffered from mental illness. But in Hysteria, he's talking about a sort of a scene, presumably with his wife at a cafe. And this is prose, this is stream of consciousness. That's why it doesn't look like a sort of standard line poem. But he says, as she laughed, I was aware of becoming involved in her laughter and being part of it until her teeth were only accidental stars with a talent for squad drill. I was drawn in by short gasps, inhaled at each momentary recovery, lost finally in the dark caverns of her throat, bruised by the ripple of unseen muscles. An elderly waiter with trembling hands was hurriedly spreading a pink and white checked cloth over the rusty green iron table, saying, if the lady and gentleman wish to take their tea in the garden, if the lady and gentleman wish to take their tea in the garden. I decided that if the shaking of her breasts could be stopped, some of the fragments of the afternoon might be collected, and I concentrated my attention with careful subtlety to this end. So, we think about things that are going on in this poem, right? This sort of upheaval, explosion of a mental health episode, right? An episode of mental illness, of what is called hysteria. And hysteria, was, oddly enough, hysteria was thought, just to give you a little backstory, was this idea that was put forth by thinkers like Sigmund Freud, who thought that mental illness in women came from their uterus. The word uterus and the word hysteria have the same Greek origin, Greek and Latin origin. So, this idea of mental illness as something being feminine and of being uncontrollable and of being scary, right? Of making men, right? The men in this poem particularly feel powerless, feel like a scramble to get back to normalcy, right? All of those are going on, right? Not just in this poem, but in other writings of T.S. Eliot's. This not only fear of the, like I said, the inexplicable nature and sometimes the chaos of experiencing episodes of mental illness, which Eliot did. Eliot, soon after he first became famous as a writer, experienced a nervous breakdown where he convalesced in Lausanne, Switzerland for. So, it's by attributing this sort of mental illness specifically to women, it's that separating of like, well, I know I have it, I know I deal with it, but I'm going to make it this external thing, right? I'm going to feminize it, because if I do that, it's no longer me, right? I'm separate from it. And I think that's fascinating because Freud did the same thing. Freud's studies on hysteria, where he talked about how hysteria comes from women and their uteruses, which is complete nonsense, by the way. I'm sure you got that. But Freud's discussion of this, the subjects that he studied were actually male. He just changed them to women in his writing. So there's this early 20th century, and some might even say present day, fixation, fear of mental illness as this, feminine eruption that leaves men feeling powerless, whether it be within themselves or within women. And so again, if I were to just say, he's sexist and ableist, like, nah, you know, that's not going to get me very far. But if I do some research and I study and I think critically and I detach myself and my feelings from this and look at it critically with that skeptical eye that Samuel Johnson encourages us to have, right? That kind of grouchy, like, BS detector, for lack of a better term, then I can find all these other things about these works. And that is what critical thought is, right? It's not just having an opinion. It's not just doing research. It's the synthesis of those things. Having a skeptical, critical eye. So how do we wrap this all up? Because I've been yammering on and on for long enough, right? Well, I want you to now kind of pivot. I want you to pivot to Langston Hughes and to Walt Whitman. Read Walt Whitman first because chronologically he comes first and then Hughes follows a few decades later. But Eliot concludes the essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, by stressing the importance of understanding tradition in the past in order to create the best, the highest art, right? So if we're thinking about the canon and we're thinking about people who, quote unquote, belong in the canon, right, in the tradition, Whitman and Hughes, let's just, you know, for the sake of argument, agree that they were in their place. Like, they're in a bunch of literature textbooks. You've probably heard their names at some point. You know, they're long dead, but they're famous for their writing. So let's look at Whitman's I Hear America Singing. It's on Canvas, and Hughes's I Too. And I want you, as you're reading, clearly take notes, right? And do all the other stuff. Box the unfamiliar words, reread them, define them, reread them in context, etc. But think about the following words as you're reading these poems. These following questions, sorry. If a poet or an artist has to know the past in order to create high art, then what about the past that's been overlooked or kept from that artist, from him, her, them, from us, right? Not all the past is pretty and wonderful and high art, right? Some of it's real crud. So what about these voices that haven't been heard? What about these voices that have been suppressed? What about these unsavory things that we may not want to look at when we look at the past, right? Or if the past is told by the people who conquered or who stole or who whatever else, right? Like, what did we never know about because those other voices were silenced? What do we then know? What do we then do about the voices that have not been included in history, in culture, etc.? And thinking about this idea of tradition, right? Like, it's the past, but then we're changing it, right? When Whitman starts to write poetry, he's got the past, but then his injection of his poetry starts changing it, right? So how does he conform to tradition, and how does he create something new? And same for Hughes. How does Hughes, with this poem, right, conform to the canon? Maybe structurally, maybe in terms of form, maybe in terms of language, maybe in terms of feeling. How does he conform? And then what does he do to make something new, to include something that wasn't there before, to change the canon? So I want you to consider those questions. That's it. I want you to consider these questions when you're looking at the poems. Poems are not long, right? They're Hughes is like, 3/4 of a page. I think Whitman's maybe like a page and a half. So they're not long poems, but in the spirit of slowing down, of taking your time, of really absorbing the information, you definitely want to read them a few times to really get the point of them, right? To really understand what is being said. So do that, right? With all of the context clues and note-taking that you do for any other class. So that, and I'm going to take it off stop share. That is our notes on those readings. I hope this was helpful and fun and interesting and fascinating and, you know, all that stuff. As always, any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to message me. I'm here just, again, looking like a tomato. But yeah, so I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in cyberspace.